She had one coin left, one dress on her back, and one chance to disappear before her brother found her body first. The advertisement was barely 4 lines long. A man in the mountains, a cabin, a need for a wife. No questions asked. Most women crumpled the paper. Alara Ashcombe memorized every word. She wasn't looking for love. She wasn't even looking for safety. Safety had been a lie her entire life. She was looking for distance. Enough distance between herself and the man who had spent years reminding her that she was property, not a person. She answered the ad, and by doing so, she changed everything. Drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Hit that like button and stay with us until the very end. The post office in Caldwell Crossing smelled like sawdust and mildew, which was honestly appropriate for a town that had been slowly rotting since the railroad bypassed it 3 years ago. Alara stood at the public notice board for longer than she should have. She could feel Martha Beale watching her from behind the postal counter. That particular kind of watching where the watcher doesn't bother pretending they're doing something else. Caldwell Crossing was that kind of town. Everyone knew everyone's business, and nobody used that knowledge to help anybody. They just stored it up, like grain before winter, and spent it as gossip whenever the days got dull. The board was full of the usual notices: lost livestock, unpaid debts, a church social that had already passed 3 weeks ago and hadn't been taken down because no one felt strongly enough either way. But in the lower right corner, slightly crooked, was a square of paper that someone had pinned up with unusual care. 2 pins instead of 1, as if they understood the wind in this valley and didn't trust a single point of contact. Seeking, a wife of honest character for mountain settlement. Hard work required. Loneliness guaranteed. No patience for cruelty or deception on either side. Arrangements practical, not romantic. Reply to G. Vale, Box 7. Alara read it twice. Then a third time. No patience for cruelty or deception on either side. That phrase stopped her completely. Not the part about hard work. Not the warning about loneliness. That phrase, on either side, because it implied something radical, that cruelty was worth naming, and that it could travel in both directions, that the man writing had thought about it enough to mention it. In her 24 years of life, Alara had encountered very few men who thought about cruelty as something they might also be capable of. Most of them considered themselves the standard by which behavior was measured. Whatever they did was simply what was done. "You need to mail something?" Martha called from the counter. Not a question, really. More of a signal that loitering was being noted. "I need paper and a pen," Alara said. "Please." She wrote the reply standing at the postal counter because she didn't have a table of her own to go home to. She'd been staying in the back room of the laundry for 2 months, sleeping on a folded canvas behind the boiler, which kept her warm but smelled permanently of lye and other people's dirty clothing. Ruth, the laundry owner, had been generous. Generous had a limit, though, and Alara had been watching it approach like a distant storm, visible on the horizon, inevitable, impossible to stop. She kept the letter short, not because she had nothing to say, but because she had learned that too many words gave people too many angles to criticize. "Mr. Vale, I am answering your notice in good faith. I am 24 years old. I am healthy and capable of hard work. I have experience with cooking, mending, preservation, and the general management of a household under difficult circumstances. I am not looking for comfort or luxury. I am looking for a situation where I can be useful without being punished for it. I will be honest with you about my circumstances if you will be honest with me about yours. E. Ashcombe, Caldwell Crossing." She read it over once. It sounded a little like a business contract and almost nothing like a woman writing to a stranger she might marry. But she had tried softer language in her life before, and it had never protected her. Soft language was for people who didn't need protection. She paid for the postage with one of her last 2 coins and handed the envelope to Martha, who took it without a word and immediately turned it over to read the address on the front. "Mountain Settlement," Martha said. It wasn't a question, it was more like a verdict. "Yes," Alara said. Martha looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who considers themselves too polite to say what they actually think. "Long way from town." "That's the intention," Alara replied. She left before Martha could say anything else. The reply came 11 days later, which was faster than Alara expected, given the mail situation in Mountain Territory. It was brief, briefer even than her own letter. Miss Ashcombe, your letter said everything that needed saying. My situation, cabin at 4,000 feet, 2 days north of Harlan Pass. Winters are serious. I hunt, trap, and do some timber work. The isolation is real, and I won't pretend otherwise. I've had this land 7 years, and I know its moods. I won't make your life harder than it already is. That's the best I can honestly promise. If that's enough, come on the 15th. G. Vale. I won't make your life harder than it already is. Elara read the line 4 times. She was sitting behind the boiler when the letter was delivered, and she stayed there for a long while with the paper in both hands. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't charming, it wasn't the kind of thing a young woman was supposed to thrill over, but it was the single most honest thing any man had ever said to her, because he wasn't promising happiness or security or a good life. He was just promising not to add to the damage already done. In her experience, that was extraordinarily rare. She wrote back that evening, I'll be at Harlan Pass on the 15th. E. Ashcombe. She mailed it and then went back to the laundry and started packing the only things she had. One change of clothes, a small knife she kept wrapped in flannel at the bottom of her bag, her mother's thimble, which she kept not because she sewed particularly well, but because it was the only thing her mother had given her before she died, and a small amount of money collected in careful increments over 2 months of work. She didn't tell anyone she was leaving. There were no goodbyes to make. That was one of the specific cruelties of the life she'd been living. She had been in Caldwell Crossing for 2 years and had not been permitted to make a single real friend. Silas had made sure of it. Silas Ashcombe was her brother by blood and her captor by practice. He was 6 years older than her, which he had always treated as a form of moral authority. Their father had died when Elara was 9 and Silas was 15, and Silas had stepped into the absence with the specific confidence of someone who had been waiting for the opportunity. Their mother lasted 3 more years before grief and hard labor finished what poverty had started, and after that it was only the 2 of them, which meant it was really only Silas. He was not a monster in the storybook sense. He didn't have a villain's dramatic flair. He was something quieter and more exhausting than that. A man who believed completely that he was doing right by his sister, and who expressed that belief through control so complete that Elara sometimes forgot what her own preferences felt like. She was not allowed to work without his approval, not allowed to speak to men he hadn't vetted, not allowed to save money or keep correspondence or make any decision about her own life without his prior knowledge. When she tried, the consequences were physical, not theatrical. Silas wasn't theatrical, just practical. A reminder, he called it. Just keeping things sensible. 2 years ago, he'd brought them both to Caldwell Crossing to follow a mining rumor that came to nothing. He took work at the assay office and installed Elara at the laundry and considered the arrangement settled. For a while, she had believed it was 2. Then she found the notice board. Then she found the letter from G. Vale. She left before dawn on the 14th, not the 15th, because she wasn't willing to risk Silas coming to find her 1 day early. She walked 4 miles to the edge of town and waited in the gray light beside the road north, until a supply wagon heading toward Harlan came along, and the driver, an old man with a white beard and no interest in other people's affairs, let her ride in the back without a single question. She watched Caldwell Crossing disappear behind her. She felt nothing she expected to feel. No relief, exactly. No joy, just a strange, flat alertness, like a rabbit in open ground, aware that the danger behind her was less than the open space ahead, but not yet certain it was safe to run. Harlan Pass in November was a gray and windswept place where the mountains showed their bones. The trees up here were different from the ones in the valley. Shorter, older-looking, bent by a decade of winter winds into postures of permanent resignation. The air was sharp enough to feel like a warning. The supply wagon deposited her at a crossroads with a single weathered post that said, Harlan, 2 miles pointing south and offered nothing pointing north. The driver tipped his hat and kept going without ever having learned her name, which she appreciated. Elara waited. She was good at waiting. She had developed the skill over years of having no other option. He arrived 20 minutes after the appointed time, which was actually earlier than she'd expected given the terrain. She heard the horse before she saw him, a big roan with the calm disposition of an animal accustomed to difficult ground. And then Gideon Vale came around the bend in the trail and stopped about 30 feet away, and the 2 of them looked at each other across the frozen ground for a moment before either one spoke. He was large, That was her first impression. Not aggressive large, not the kind of large that immediately made the back of her neck prickle, but solid in the way that mountains were solid. Dark coat, well worn, dark hair going silver at the temples, though he couldn't have been more than 35. A beard, kept short. His face was weathered, and he had the eyes of someone who spent a significant amount of time outdoors and a corresponding amount of time alone. Careful eyes, observant, giving very little away. He looked at her bag, the smallness of it, and something moved across his face that was not pity, but might have been its more useful neighbor, recognition. "Miss Ashcombe," he said. "Mr. Vale," she said. A pause. The wind pushed a scrap of dead leaves across the road between them. "You're younger than I expected," he said. Not an accusation, just an observation. "You're quieter than I expected," she replied, which was true. She had constructed 3 or 4 different versions of this man in her head over the past 2 weeks, and all of them had spoken more than this one. Something that was not quite a smile crossed his face. "That's a fair trade," he said. "I've got a circuit judge meeting us up at Halverson's if you're still decided." "I'm decided." "All right then." He moved the horse alongside the road. "You can ride. It's 2 hours to the cabin after we clear the ceremony, and the light goes early up here this time of year." She looked at the horse, which looked back at her with a mild expression. "Is it gentle?" she asked. "Enough," he said. She appreciated that he didn't oversell it. The ceremony at Halverson's was conducted in the front room of what appeared to be a trading post that had been converted, with minimal enthusiasm, into a temporary chapel by the addition of 2 candles and a Bible on the counter. The circuit judge was a small man named Aldridge, who had the professional efficiency of someone who performed this particular service often and had stopped attaching sentimentality to it. There were 2 witnesses, Halverson himself, a Finnish man with almost no English, and his wife, who had plenty but chose not to deploy it. Judge Aldridge ran through the words at a pace that suggested a schedule to keep. Alara and Gideon stood beside each other, not touching, maintaining a careful professional distance, and answered at the appropriate moments. "Do you, Alara Ashcombe, take this man—" "Yes," she said, before he finished the sentence, which caused Aldridge to pause briefly and recalibrate. When it was done, Gideon produced a ring from his coat pocket, a plain gold band, modest, appropriate, and slid it onto her finger. It was slightly too big. She closed her hand to keep it from sliding. "I'll get it sized when we're in town next," he said, quietly, just for her. "Didn't know the fit." "It's fine," she said. "It's not, but we'll fix it." She looked up at him. He was already looking at the judge, who was writing in his ledger. There was something careful in the way Gideon moved through the world, she noticed, a deliberateness that was different from slowness. He thought before he acted. It was, in her experience, a rarer quality than it should have been. Halverson's wife pressed a small piece of cake into Alara's hands as they left. Ginger cake, still warm. Alara ate it on the road because she hadn't eaten since before dawn and she was hungry, and because it seemed a shame to let good ginger cake go cold for the sake of dignity. "Good?" Gideon asked from ahead of her on the trail. "Very," she said. He nodded once, like a man filing information. They rode on into the trees. The cabin was nothing like what she'd feared and nothing like what she'd hoped for, which meant it was exactly what he'd described, a place designed for surviving, not for comfort. But it was solid. That registered first. The logs were well fitted, the roof showed no obvious signs of disaster, and the chimney was drawing cleanly. She could see the smoke rising straight and even in the still evening air. There was a woodpile stacked with the kind of patient thoroughness that told her something about how this man spent his time. There was a small barn, a fence line that was repaired instead of abandoned, a root cellar with a proper door. She stood in the yard and looked at it all, and Gideon stood a few feet away, giving her space, watching her face. "It's small," he said. Not apologetic, just accurate. "I know," she said. "Your letter said—" "Single room, mostly. I've got a curtain partition. I'll sleep on the near side. You take the back." "All right." "The stove runs warm once it's going, cold in the mornings until it gets going." "I can light a stove," she said. He looked at her. "I know you can," he said. "I'm just—" He stopped, started again. "I don't know how much of this I should explain. and how much I should just let you discover. I'm not trying to condescend." "Then don't," she said simply. He nodded. "Fair enough." Inside, the cabin smelled of pine and wood smoke and something else, dried herbs, she discovered later, hanging in bundles from the rafters. He'd put them up for practical reasons. They were mostly medicinal and culinary, not decorative. But they softened the space in a way that she didn't expect, and she stood in the middle of the room for a moment, looking up at them, the ring heavy and slightly loose on her finger. "You can put your things anywhere that makes sense to you," Gideon said from the doorway. He was leaning in the frame, not coming in yet, as if the interior was hers to claim first. "I've cleared the shelf on the right side." She set her bag down on the cleared shelf. It looked very small and very solitary sitting there. "Mr. Vale," she said. "Gideon," he said. She turned around. He was watching her with that same careful expression he'd had at the pass. "Why did you place the advertisement?" she asked. She'd been carrying the question for 2 weeks. He was quiet for a moment. "Because I'd been alone up here for 7 years," he said, "and I'd gotten to the point where I was forgetting what another person's voice sounded like. And because the work is better divided, and I'm honest enough to admit it." He paused. "And because I figured there had to be someone out there who needed the mountain more than they needed anything the valley was offering. Was I wrong?" She thought about the post office, the notice board, the single coin she'd used to send her first letter. "No," she said. "You weren't wrong." He nodded once. "Then we'll figure it out," he said, and came inside and closed the door on the cold. The fire caught quickly. Outside, the first real snow of the season had begun to fall. Not hard, not threatening, just the quiet accumulation of white over everything, covering the road she'd arrived on, softening the edges of the world. Alara sat near the stove with both hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee Gideon had made without being asked and set in front of her without ceremony, and she looked at the fire, and for the first time in longer than she could accurately measure, nobody was watching her to make sure she didn't get any ideas. She didn't know yet what to do with that. She would have to learn. The first morning was the hardest, and not for the reasons Alara expected. She woke before dawn in the unfamiliar dark, disoriented in the way that happens when the body hasn't yet caught up with the decisions the mind has made. For 3 full seconds, she didn't know where she was. The smell was wrong. Wood smoke instead of lye, pine instead of damp canvas. And the silence was a different kind of silence than she was used to. Not the silence of a town at night, which was really just the absence of visible activity over a continuous low hum of existence. This was actual silence. The kind with weight to it, the kind that pressed against your ears and made you aware that you were a very small warm thing in a very large cold place. Then the stove popped, and she remembered. She lay still for a moment, listening. On the other side of the curtain partition, she could hear Gideon's breathing, slow and even, still asleep. She checked the ring on her finger, still slightly loose, still real. She got up quietly, found her boots in the dark without knocking anything over, and went to deal with the stove before he woke up. Not to impress him, just because she needed something to do with her hands. The wood was stacked right beside the stove, which she would later understand was a deliberate habit. You never let the indoor stack run out, because a cold cabin at 4,000 feet in November was not a minor inconvenience, it was a genuine emergency. She fed the fire the way she'd been doing it since she was 12 years old, and by the time the light had shifted from black to gray outside the single front window, the cabin had begun to warm at the edges. She found the coffee tin on the shelf, found the pot, found water in the barrel by the door. She was putting the pot on when the curtain moved and Gideon appeared, still in yesterday's shirt, hair pushed to one side by sleep, looking at her with an expression of mild surprise that he wasn't bothering to conceal. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. I wanted something to do." He seemed to accept that without needing more explanation. He pulled on his coat. It was still cold enough in the cabin that their breath showed faintly, and went outside to see to the horse and check on something at the woodpile without explaining himself, which she appreciated. She wasn't ready to be watched while she found her way around someone else's kitchen. When he came back in, stamping snow off his boots, she had 2 cups ready. He sat down at the table, a heavy, square thing he'd obviously built himself, not pretty, but extremely solid, and wrapped his hands around the cup and didn't say a word about whether the coffee was good or not. He just drank it, looking at the window, and she sat across from him and did the same. It should have been awkward. By every reasonable measure, it should have been excruciating. Two strangers at a table, married less than 24 hours, with no shared history and no particular reason to trust each other. But it wasn't, quite. There was something honest about the silence, the same way his letter had been honest. It didn't ask her to perform anything. "What do you need to know?" he asked eventually. She looked up. "What do you mean?" "About the place, the routine, what needs doing, and when." He set down his cup. "I've been doing it alone long enough that I don't always think to explain things, but you can't do your half if you don't know how things run." Your half. Not a test. Not a courtesy. Just a straightforward acknowledgement that there were two people here now, and the work would be divided accordingly. "Show me everything," she said. So he did. Not all at once. The mountain didn't allow for complete orientations. It demanded attention one task at a time, one day at a time, and so that was how Gideon taught. That first week unfolded as a series of practical lessons delivered without ceremony and without condescension, which was a combination Alara had almost never encountered in her life. He showed her the root cellar and what was stored where, and why the organization mattered. Everything in a specific place so you could find it by feel in the dark if you had to. He showed her how to check the weather by reading the mountain and the trees rather than just the sky, because the sky at 4,000 feet could lie to you in ways that got people killed. He showed her the property lines, the path to the nearest stream, the spot where the trail to Harlan Pass began, and the landmarks to navigate by when snow covered everything else. He showed her how to use the shotgun. That one surprised her. They were 3 days in, and she came around the side of the cabin to find him waiting with the gun broken open and a box of shells on the fence post beside him, and he handed it to her without preamble. "You need to know this," he said. "I've never fired a gun," she said. "I know. That's why we're doing this now." He watched her take the gun, noted how she held it, careful, correct instincts even without training, and nodded slightly. "Close it," he said. "Like this." He demonstrated with his hands without taking it from her. She closed it. It was heavier than she'd expected. "It's not because I think you'll need it," he said, stepping back to give her room. "It's because knowing you can use it changes how you carry yourself, and how you carry yourself matters up here." She thought about that for a moment. "You mean it affects how afraid you are?" "Something like that," he said. "Go ahead and aim at that far post. Don't fire yet, just find it." She raised the gun. Her arms were steadier than she expected. She found the post and held it. "Your shoulder," he said. "Bring it in tighter or it'll knock you sideways." She adjusted. He didn't touch her to correct the position, which she noted. He described with words and trusted her to translate it physically. When she fired, it knocked her back a full step, and the post survived completely unharmed, the shot going high and left. Her ears rang. "Again," he said. She reloaded. He'd shown her how, and fired again. Better. Not good, but better. She shot 8 more times before her arms started shaking from the weight, and she hit the post cleanly twice, which Gideon marked with a single nod that she was coming to understand was his version of genuine approval. "We'll do this every few days," he said, taking the gun to clean it. "You'll get it?" "Was that your first instinct?" she asked. "Teaching me to shoot?" He considered the question seriously. "No," he said. "My first instinct was to do everything myself and not ask anything of you until you'd settled in." He glanced at her. "But that would have been the wrong call. You're not someone who does well with being managed." She stared at him. "How can you possibly know that? We've known each other 3 days." "You made coffee before I woke up on day 1, he said, "because you needed to be useful before anyone could tell you whether you were allowed to be. That tells me something." She didn't respond to that, because she couldn't find a way to argue with it. The nights were the strangest part of those early weeks. They were not uncomfortable exactly, but they had an odd suspended quality. Two people navigating the narrow space between politeness and genuine ease, not quite there yet, not willing to rush. After supper they would sit near the stove, and Alara would mend things or go through the dry goods inventory taking notes on what needed replenishing, and Gideon would work on whatever equipment needed attention. Traps, harness fittings, the axe handles that always seemed to need something. And they would talk or not talk in roughly equal measure. The conversations, when they happened, were gradual excavations. Neither of them offered large pieces of themselves directly. It came out in the edges of practical discussion. He mentioned his family once in passing, a father who'd been a trapper in the same territory, a mother who died when he was young, a brother he'd lost contact with before either of them was 20. He said these things with the specific flatness of someone who has processed grief to the point where it's just part of the geography of their life. Not an open wound, but a permanent scar. She said almost nothing about her own history in those first weeks, and he didn't press. He seemed to understand without being told that there were things she would share when she was ready and things she might never share, and that the only reasonable approach was to let her set the pace. What she did offer, by accident more than intention, were reactions. The way she flinched, barely, quickly controlled, when he moved unexpectedly in her peripheral vision, the way she sat with her back to walls and her eyes toward doors, the way she sometimes woke in the middle of the night with a sharpness that wasn't quite panic, but was its close relative. He never commented on any of it, but she could tell he was cataloging it, the same careful way he cataloged the weather and the state of the trail. Not to use it against her, just to know. One night in the third week, the stove was doing its best work, and the wind had picked up outside, the kind of sustained moan that made the cabin feel smaller and more significant. And Gideon was working on a trap spring that had been giving him trouble. And Alara, without particularly planning to, said, "My brother used to lock the pantry." Gideon didn't look up. He kept working on the trap. "So I would have to ask him when I was hungry," she continued. "Every time. Even if I was cooking for both of us, I had to ask to use the food." She paused. "He said it kept things organized." A long moment of quiet. The wind pushed against the roof. "How long?" Gideon asked. "Years," she said. He set down the trap. He looked at her then, not with pity. She would have left the room for pity, but with the steady eye of a man trying to understand the dimensions of something. "The food here," he said. "The root cellar, the pantry, everything on those shelves. It's yours the same as it's mine. You don't ask me. You take what you need." She nodded. "I'm going to say that again," he said, quietly, "because I want it to land properly. You don't ask me. Not for food, not for firewood, not for anything in this cabin that keeps you alive. You just take it. This is your house." She looked at the fire. Her throat was doing something she didn't want it to do. "You don't have to make speeches about it," she said, a little unevenly. "I know," he said. "I'm going to anyway." She almost smiled. It came out crooked and probably looked more like a wince, but it was the closest thing to a real smile she'd managed in longer than she could track. He picked the trap back up and went back to work. She went back to mending the seam on his extra coat that had been splitting at the shoulder. The wind continued its commentary outside. Neither of them said anything else for a while, but the quality of the silence had shifted, the way air shifts before weather changes. Subtle, significant, and impossible to ignore once you'd noticed it. December arrived with the kind of authority that made it clear November had been a rehearsal. The snow came in layers rather than storms. Accumulation so steady and so complete that within 2 weeks the ground-level world had reorganized itself entirely. The fence posts showed only their tops. The trail to the pass disappeared under 3 feet of white. The mountain became a completely different place than it had been in autumn, and learning to live in it required starting almost from scratch. Gideon moved through winter at a different pace, slower in some ways, because every action had to account for the cold and the weight of snow, and faster in others because certain problems in winter compounded quickly if not addressed immediately. He had the rhythm of it the way a musician has a rhythm, not thinking about it consciously, just moving inside it. Alara spent a lot of that first month trying to find her own rhythm inside his without either colliding with it or losing herself in it. She nearly got lost in the second week of December. It was her own fault, and she knew it immediately. She'd gone to check on the mare. They'd started to develop a careful mutual understanding, the horse and Alara, built on Alara always having something in her pocket and the horse having the minimal dignity of accepting it. And on the way back, she'd gone 6 steps off the path to look at something she thought might be a snowshoe hare. And in the time it took to discover it was just a lump of snow shaped. Interestingly, the light had shifted and the path back to the cabin was not where her eyes expected it to be. She stopped immediately, which was the right instinct. She stood still and breathed and looked around carefully, and there was the barn. There were the fence posts. There was, yes, the corner of the roof visible just over the slight ridge between her and the door. It took her 2 minutes to find her way back. No longer. But she arrived in the cabin with her heart still loud in her chest and her face probably showing more than she intended because Gideon looked up from the table and read her immediately. "You went off the path," he said. "Just for a moment. I found it again." "I know," he said. "I saw you from the window." He paused. "I was going to come out, but you didn't." "No." He met her eyes. "You were handling it." She sat down heavily on the bench near the door and unlaced her boots. Her hands were steadier than she expected. "What if I hadn't been?" she asked. "Then I would have come out." He said it simply, like it wasn't a complicated calculation at all. "But you were, so I waited." She thought about all the times in her life that someone had rushed in before she could handle something herself. All the ways that help had been weaponized into proof of her own inadequacy. She thought about what it had done to her, the way she'd started to believe it, the way she'd lost track of where her actual capabilities ended, and where the story she'd been told about herself began. "I need you to know," she said, pulling off the second boot, "that I'm better at things than I currently appear." "I can see that," he said. "I'm still—" She stopped. "I got used to not being allowed to try things. It takes time to unlearn that." He was quiet for a moment. "My father," he said slowly, "used to say that a trap doesn't have to be made of iron. The best ones are made of the thing the animal trusts." He looked at her. "That's not a lecture. I just think about that sometimes." She turned it over in her mind. The thing the animal trusts. Not chains, not locks. Something softer. Her brother's version of concern. His version of family. "That's a very grim metaphor," she said. "It's an accurate one." "Yes," she admitted. "It is." She put her boots by the stove to dry and went to start supper, and Gideon went back to his work, and the cabin held them both in its imperfect warmth, while the mountain outside continued its indifferent accumulation of white. January brought a cold so total and so ancient feeling that it seemed less like weather and more like a fundamental fact of existence. The thermometer on the outside wall read temperatures that Ilara had never experienced in the valley, and she understood now why Gideon had been so deliberate about the woodpile, the root cellar, the preserved food. Winter up here wasn't a season you endured. It was a season you prepared for the way you'd prepare for a siege. But she was learning. That was the thing she held on to during the hardest days. She was learning faster than she'd expected, because Gideon taught without impatience, and she absorbed without pride getting in the way. She learned to read the mare's behavior as a weather gauge. The horse knew before any other sign that a serious storm was coming, and she'd go quiet and still in a particular way that Ilara learned to recognize and respect. She learned which roots in the cellar were for eating and which were medicinal, and the difference between a cold that needed warmth and rest and one that needed the specific tea Gideon kept in the tin on the highest shelf. She learned that the mountain itself had sounds, particular creaks and silences and wind patterns that meant different things, and that listening to it was a skill as real and learnable as any other. She also learned that Gideon had nightmares. She didn't know what they were about. She didn't ask. But on 2 occasions in January, she woke in the dark to the sound of him on the other side of the curtain. A low, involuntary sound, something between a word and a groan. The sound a person makes when they are fighting something in their sleep that they can't fight properly. Both times she lay still and listened and waited, and both times the sounds stopped and were followed by the deliberate long exhalation of a man forcing himself back to calm. In the morning after the second time, he was quieter than usual. She didn't acknowledge it directly. She just made the coffee and put it in front of him and sat down across the table and told him she thought the mare was going to need her feet checked soon, which was true, and they talked about that instead. Later that day, out at the barn while she was holding the mare's head and Gideon was checking her hooves, he said, without looking up, "I know you heard." "Yes," she said. A pause. The horse shifted her weight. "I was in a bad situation a few years back," he said. "Logging accident. Man died. I was the one who found him." He was still looking at the hoof, turning it in his hands. "I don't always sleep well." She stroked the mare's nose and didn't say she was sorry, because she had always hated when people said that as if it helped. Instead, she said, "Do you want to talk about it? or would you rather I just know? He looked up at her then. Something in his face shifted. Not emotion exactly, more like the settling of something that had been slightly out of alignment. Just know is fine, he said. All right, she said. I just know then. He went back to the hoof. The mare breathed warm air into the cold barn. Outside, the mountain held its January silence, vast and indifferent, and somehow, despite everything, less lonely than it had been in November. She was still afraid sometimes. That didn't stop. There were mornings she woke with the old familiar tightness in her chest, and it took her a moment to locate where she was and to confirm, again, that the particular danger she'd been living under was 40 miles south and did not know where she'd gone. The fear didn't vanish just because the circumstances had changed. It had been in her long enough to develop its own habits. But there was something happening alongside it, something quieter and harder to name, a slow recalibration. The incremental experience of days that passed without anything being taken from her, days where she was cold or sore or frustrated by her own limitations, but where no one punished her for those feelings or used them as evidence of her inadequacy. Days where she went to bed having done real work and knowing it had mattered, and woke up to do more of it, and was not told what that work was worth. She caught herself, one evening in late January, sitting by the fire with Gideon's coat in her lap. She'd been reinforcing all the seams which needed doing, and realized she had gone the entire day without once calculating where the nearest door was. It was such a small thing. So small, she almost missed it. She kept it to herself. But she held on to it, the way she held on to her mother's thimble, not because it solved anything, but because it was real, and it was hers, and no one could take it back. The snow outside the window was blue in the last light. The stove was ticking warmly. Across the cabin, Gideon was making notes in a small battered ledger he kept for tracking the trapping lines, and his handwriting, she had learned, was surprisingly careful for a man whose hands were so large. She'd noticed that weeks ago and hadn't said anything about it. She noticed things about him the way she noticed things about the mountain, gradually, without trying, because paying attention to your surroundings was how you survived, and surviving was something she was determined to get very, very good at. The ledger scratched. The fire settled. The mountain said nothing, as it always did, and meant everything, as it always had. February on the mountain had a specific personality that March never quite managed to replicate. February was the month that had given up pretending winter would end. It had settled into its coldness with a kind of grim permanence that Alara had come to respect, if not exactly appreciate. The snow wasn't falling anymore. It had fallen, accumulated, compressed into something ancient and structural, and now it simply existed as the dominant fact of the landscape, reordering everything around it. She'd stopped counting days sometime in the middle of January. Not because time had ceased to matter, but because it had started to matter differently. The mountain ran on its own calendar: firewood levels, food stores, the mare's needs, the trapping line schedule, and that calendar had gradually replaced the one she'd arrived with. She knew it was February because Gideon had made a note in the ledger, not because she'd been tracking it herself. That was a change she noticed without quite being able to articulate what it meant. She was at the woodpile splitting kindling when she heard the mare make a sound inside the barn. Not distressed exactly, but attentive, alert. The particular stillness that Alara had learned to read over the past 2 months as the horse's version of paying very close attention to something outside the range of human perception. Alara set down the hatchet. She stood still and listened. The mountain gave her nothing immediately useful. Wind in the upper trees, the kind that moved through the canopy without reaching the ground. The distant sound of something settling in the snowpack further up the slope. Nothing that explained the mare's response. She picked the hatchet back up and finished the kindling and carried it inside, and she didn't say anything about it because there was nothing specific to say, but she filed it away, the way she'd been learning to file all the small signals this place generated, not discarding them just because they didn't yet have context. Gideon came back from the eastern trapping line that afternoon with 2 pine martens and a coyote pelt, and the particular tired look he wore after a long day on snowshoes. She had coffee waiting and supper mostly done, and he sat at the table and pulled off his outer layers and didn't speak for a while, which was normal. "How was the eastern line?" she asked. "Productive," he said. "Snow's settled well out there. Good for the sets." He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. "How was here?" "Quiet," she said. Then, After a moment, "The mayor was restless this afternoon." He looked up from the cup. It was a small look, but she'd learned to read his small looks. This one was the one that meant he was taking something seriously without having decided yet what to do about it. "What kind of restless?" he asked. "Alert, not spooked, like she was listening." He nodded once, set the cup down. "I'll go check on her after supper." "I already did," Alara said. "She was fine by the time I went in, but it was you know that thing she does when she goes very still, the listening thing?" "Yes," he said. "I know that thing." They ate supper without discussing it further. But afterward, instead of settling into the evening the way they normally did, Gideon put his coat back on and went outside with the lantern and was gone for 20 minutes. When he came back, he set the lantern on the table and sat back down and looked at the fire for a moment before he spoke. "There are tracks," he said, "on the north side of the property, coming down from the ridge trail." Alara felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. "What kind of tracks?" "Shod horse," he said. "One rider. They came down as far as the tree line and then turned back." He paused. "Probably yesterday or early today, before the afternoon wind. The edges are still sharp." She was quiet. The fire made its ordinary sounds. The cold thing in her chest did not go away. "Someone was looking at the cabin," she said. It wasn't a question. "Someone was looking at the cabin," he confirmed. He didn't add anything alarming to it. He didn't add reassurances either, which she appreciated more than the reassurances would have been. He just said the fact and let it sit between them, the way honest facts deserve to sit. "It could be anyone," she said. She heard her own voice doing the thing it did when she was managing herself. Flat, careful, controlled. "Travelers use the ridge trail." "They do," he said. "In summer. Not often in February." She looked at him. He was watching her with the steady, unrevealing expression she'd come to understand meant he was paying more attention than he appeared to be paying. "Silas," she said. The name came out smaller than she intended. Gideon didn't react with surprise. She wasn't sure he was capable of that particular reaction. He seemed to process most things in a way that suggested he'd already considered a range of possibilities before settling on a response. "Is that who you left behind?" he asked. She'd never told him directly. She'd given him pieces over the months, fragments that someone paying attention could assemble into a shape, but she'd never handed him the whole picture in one statement. She did that now because the tracks in the snow had changed the geometry of things. "My brother," she said. "Older. He considered himself responsible for me. That's not what it was, but that's the word he used. Responsible." She was looking at the fire as she spoke. "I didn't tell anyone where I was going when I left. I paid for the wagon ride with one of my last coins, and I didn't leave a note, and I didn't say goodbye to anyone who might have talked." She paused. "I thought that was enough." "It might have been enough," Gideon said. "If he doesn't have resources or contacts north of Caldwell." He said it evenly, not to comfort her, but to be accurate. "Or it might not have been. He's not a man who accepts not knowing," she said. "He would have asked questions. He would have been persistent about it." She thought about Silas's particular brand of persistence, the way he never raised his voice when he was truly determined, because truly determined people didn't need to. He has patience when he wants something. Gideon was quiet for a moment. "Tell me about him," he said. "Not the history, just who is he? What does he do when he's pushed?" It was such a specific question. She looked at him. "He doesn't react when he's pushed," she said slowly, working it out as she spoke. "He waits. He gathers information. He decides on a plan, and then he executes it without announcing it. He doesn't make threats. He just does things." She stopped. The worst part was never knowing when. You just knew it was coming. Gideon absorbed that. How far would he go? "To bring me back?" "Yes." She thought about it honestly because Gideon was asking honestly, and because the stakes were too high for anything less. "Far," she said. "I think farther than most people would guess by looking at him. He doesn't look like someone who would ride 2 days into Winter Mountain territory, but he would." She turned the thimble over in her pocket, the habit of her hands when she was thinking. He would, because in his mind he's not doing something wrong. He genuinely believes he's correcting a mistake, that I made a dangerous choice and he's protecting me from it. And the violence? The question landed quietly, but it landed. It was always correction, she said. Not rage. He was never out of control. That's what made it. She stopped, started again. A person out of control can learn to stop. A person who believes they're being reasonable doesn't see any reason to. Gideon sat with that for a long while, long enough that the fire burned down a quarter inch and she almost said something to fill the silence, but held back. All right, he said finally. Just that. All right. What does that mean? She asked. It means I understand what we're dealing with, he said, and that we're not going to panic, and we're not going to pretend it isn't happening. He stood up and added a piece of wood to the fire with the same deliberate economy he brought to everything. Starting tomorrow, I'll keep the rifle inside instead of in the barn. Not for use, for presence. And I want you to know where it is at all times. He turned around. And I want you to decide what you want to do if he comes. She blinked. What I want to do? Yes. Don't you? She stopped herself, tried again. You're not going to tell me the plan? Something moved across his face that might have been sadness and might have been anger at something distant and not present in the room. This is your life, he said quietly. If your brother comes to this door, that confrontation belongs to you. I'll be standing right here, but I'm not going to decide how it goes. He paused. You've had enough people deciding things for you. She stared at him for what was probably an awkward amount of time. Nobody has ever said that to me before, she said. Her voice came out with an edge she hadn't intended. Not an angry edge, but a raw one. I know, he said. Think about it. We don't know that it's him yet. We don't know anything yet. But when we do, I want you to have already decided. She nodded. She didn't trust herself to say more than that. He went to bank the fire for the night, and she sat in the chair by the stove for a long time after he'd gone behind the curtain, turning over what he'd said. Deciding. The word felt strange in her mouth, like a word in a language she'd been studying for years but had never yet been allowed to speak out loud. She thought about Silas, about the specific geography of his face when he was displeased, the way his jaw set, the way his eyes went flat and patient as a stone. She thought about the last time she'd seen him, 2 days before she left, when he'd come into the laundry to bring her supper she hadn't asked for and stood there while she ate it, not saying much, just present. Occupying the space, making the room smaller by being in it. She thought about what she would say to him if he came through the door of this cabin. She didn't have the words yet, but she stayed with the question until the fire was just coals and the cold had crept back in at the window edges. And by the time she went to bed, she had the beginning of an answer, which was more than she'd had before. The tracks were not repeated in the next 3 days, which was almost worse than if they had been. The absence of new information left everything in a state of suspension that Alara found more taxing than fear itself. She kept working, kept splitting kindling, kept checking the stores, kept drilling with the shotgun on the days Gideon set up the targets on the fence post. Because work was the only thing that reliably displaced the kind of waiting that lived in the body and not the mind. She was getting better with the gun. Genuinely better, not just competent by comparison to before. Gideon had started moving the target farther out, and her groupings were tightening, and he'd stopped giving corrections because she'd started giving them to herself. That shift had happened gradually, and she hadn't noticed it until one afternoon she squeezed off a shot, felt immediately what she'd done wrong with her breath, and corrected it on the next one without any comment from him at all. You're a natural, he said. No, I'm not, she said, reloading. I'm a person who wants very badly to be competent at this. That's different. Is it? He asked. Yes. Natural implies it came easily. It didn't come easily. I worked at it. He considered that. Fair distinction, he said. You worked at it, and you're good at it now. Better, she corrected. Not good yet. The almost smile. Better, he agreed. She fired again. The target didn't stand a chance. It was in the second week of February, on a morning so cold the air felt like breathing ground glass, that she came outside to find Gideon crouched at the tree line on the north side of the property, looking at something in the snow. She walked over, stood beside him. Fresh tracks. The same shod horse, but this time the rider had come closer. The tracks stopped 20 yards from the cabin wall, in the shadow of a stand of spruce, where someone could stand and see the yard clearly without being visible from the windows. They were from last night. She stood there looking at the impressions in the snow, the specific shape of them, the depth, the pattern, and felt something happen in her chest that she would have called fear, but wasn't quite fear. It was more like the moment before fear, when the mind is still doing its calculations and the body is already prepared for the conclusion. He watched the cabin, she said, flat voice, doing the management. Yes, Gideon said. Last night while we were inside. Yes, she breathed. The cold air was sharp enough to feel purposeful. He's deciding, she said, more to herself than to Gideon. He does this. He watches, and he counts things, and he decides whether the conditions are favorable. She paused. He's not ready yet. When he's ready, he won't scout again. He'll just come. Gideon stood up. He was close enough to her that she was aware of his presence without it pressing on her. That was still something she noticed, the way he occupied space without using it as a claim on the people nearby. How long? Soon, she said, when he's decided he has enough information. She looked at the tracks one more time, then deliberately turned away from them and faced the cabin instead. The wood smoke rising from the chimney, the mare's breath visible through the barn slats, the window with its ordinary rectangle of amber light even in the daytime. Her home. The word had arrived without her noticing sometime in the last few weeks, and she hadn't examined it closely enough to know when it had stopped feeling like a statement and started feeling like a fact. Gideon, she said. Yes. I've decided, she said, what I want to do. If he comes. He waited. I want to be the one to speak, she said. I don't want you to lead it. I need to be the one he hears it from. Not because I don't... She stopped, tried to find the accurate words. Not because I want to do it alone, but because if you do it, he'll spend the rest of his life believing he lost to another man. And he needs to know he lost to me. She paused. Can you stand there and let me do that? Gideon looked at her for a moment. The gray morning light was doing something honest to his face, showing the weather lines, the tiredness, the thing underneath that she still didn't have a precise name for. I can do that, he said quietly. She nodded. Then that's the plan. She turned and walked back toward the cabin, and after a moment she heard him follow, and they went inside together, and she put more wood on the fire, and he went to check the rifle, and neither of them spoke about it again that day because there was nothing more to say. The plan was set. The waiting was what was left. She was not the same woman who had stood at the notice board in Caldwell Crossing 4 months ago, reading an advertisement with a single coin in her pocket. She knew that. She couldn't have said precisely when the change had happened. It wasn't a single moment. It was an accumulation, like the snow itself, layer by layer until the landscape was something different than it had been. She could fire a shotgun. She could read the mare's moods, and the mountain's weather, and the specific language that Gideon spoke in silences and small gestures. She could split wood and dress a pelt and manage a root cellar through a mountain winter and find her way back to the cabin in the dark by landmark rather than by path. She had done all of that in 4 months, which meant the woman she had been told she was, incapable, dependent, requiring management, had been a story someone else wrote and forced her to memorize. She was learning the true story now. One day at a time, in the cold, without applause. But the tracks were still out there in the snow, coming closer each time, and somewhere on the other side of the ridge, or in a room in Harlan, or moving up the pass road in the gray winter morning, her brother was doing his calculations. Being patient in the way he was patient. She sat by the fire that evening with her hands wrapped around her cup and watched the flames do their ordinary work of consuming what fed them, and she thought about the word she'd said to Gideon that morning. Decided. And she held it the way she held the thimble, the way you hold the one thing you're sure of when everything else is in motion. Outside, the mountain said nothing. It never did. It just stood there, 4,000 feet of indifferent rock and ice, waiting to see what the people on its face would do when it mattered. She had a feeling it had seen worse than Silas Ashcombe. She had a feeling it had seen worse than all of them, and that it would be standing here long after every one of their stories had ended. That, strangely, was not a frightening thought. It was almost a comfort. She heard him before she saw him. It was the mare that gave the first warning, the same way she always did. That specific cessation of sound from the barn, the sudden held-breath stillness of an animal that has identified something its instincts classify as wrong. Alara was at the stove, adding water to the morning porridge, and the moment the barn went quiet, she set the ladle down without a sound and stood completely still and listened with everything she had. Wind, the distant percussion of ice shifting in the upper trees, and then underneath it growing, the hollow rhythmic impact of hooves on frozen ground coming up the north trail. One horse, moving at a steady, unhurried pace. Not a traveler who had lost the path. Not someone uncertain about their destination. Someone who had decided where they were going and was going there. She crossed to the curtain in 4 steps. Gideon. He was already awake. She didn't know if he'd slept at all. He appeared at the curtain gap fully dressed, which told her something, and he moved to the window and looked out at the angle that gave the best view of the North Trail without putting his face directly in the glass. "One rider," he said. "Yes." He turned and looked at her. She was already pulling on her coat. Her hands were steady, which surprised her. She'd expected them to shake, had been braced for it, but they moved through the buttons with the same practical efficiency she'd been building for 4 months, muscle memory replacing whatever her nerves were trying to do. "You remember what you decided," he said. Not a question. "Yes?" He went to the shelf where the rifle stood and checked it with the brief, practiced movement of a man who has handled firearms long enough that the check is automatic, not theatrical. He didn't load it yet. He stood it against the wall beside the door, visible, present, the way a statement can be present in a room without being spoken. The hoofbeats slowed and stopped in the yard. Neither of them moved for a moment. The fire popped once in the stove. Outside, the sound of a horse being steadied, a small snort, leather adjusting, the particular silence of a person dismounting in deliberate slow motion. Then boots on the frozen ground. Measured. Patient. 3 knocks on the door, not frantic, not aggressive. Exactly 3, evenly spaced, the kind of knock that was its own form of control, announcing presence without requesting permission. Alara walked to the door. She put her hand on the latch and breathed once, all the way out, the way Gideon had taught her to breathe before she fired the gun, emptying herself of everything that wasn't useful. Then she opened the door. Silas Ashcombe stood in her yard in a heavy gray coat with trail dust and dried snow on the shoulders, and he looked exactly as he always had, which was the most unsettling thing about him. He had the kind of face that didn't record experience. Same flat forehead, same patient jaw, same eyes that were a particular shade of brown that always made her think of river mud, opaque and without bottom. He was thinner than she remembered, or maybe the cold was doing that, pulling at his skin. He held his hat in his hands. "Alara," he said. "Silas," she said. A pause. He looked past her into the cabin. She saw his eyes locate Gideon standing back from the doorway, and she saw him process that information. The size of the man, the rifle visible against the wall, the fact that Gideon was not moving forward and not moving back. And then his eyes came back to her. "You're going to invite me in," he said. Again, not a question, a statement of how things would proceed. "No," she said. "I'm not." Something shifted in his face. Almost nothing. A millimeter of adjustment in the set of his jaw. "It's cold." "I know," she said. "You rode 2 days in it. That was your choice." "I want to talk to you." "Then talk. I can hear you from here." He looked at her for a long moment. She could feel him recalculating. She'd spent her entire life learning to read the moments when Silas recalculated, because those moments preceded everything he did, and knowing when he was doing it had been the only form of self-protection she'd had access to for years. "You left without telling me," he said. "Yes." "I was worried." "No," she said. "You were looking. That's different from worried." His jaw tightened. "You're my sister. I'm aware of that." "You're my responsibility yet I'm not." She said it quickly, before the word could fully establish itself in the air between them. "I was never that. You told yourself I was, but that's a story you made up, Silas. It's not the same as the truth." He was quiet for a beat. The wind moved through the yard and lifted a scrim of surface snow off the ground between them. He glanced past her again at Gideon, and something in his expression shifted toward the particular contempt he reserved for situations that were not going according to his expectations. "Did he tell you to say that?" Silas asked. "No one tells me to say anything," Ilara said. "That was always your thing." Silas put his hat back on. It was a slow, deliberate motion, the kind designed to communicate that he was not reacting, that he was still in command of himself and by extension the situation. She had watched that motion 100 times. It used to make her stomach drop. She noticed now that it just made her tired. "Ilara." His voice dropped, went quieter, went to the register he used when he was being final about something. "I'm not going to argue with you in a doorway in the middle of February. Come out here and talk to me properly, or let me in. Those are the options." "Neither of those are the options," she said. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to stand in my yard, and you're going to hear what I have to say, and then you're going to leave." Behind her, she was aware of Gideon, the particular quality of his stillness. She had learned to read his stillnesses the way she read the horse's moods, each one slightly different from the others. This was the stillness of someone who was holding himself deliberately in place, not passive, active restraint. "This is my home," Ilara continued. She heard her own voice doing something she didn't expect. It was level, not because she'd forced it level, but because she actually was. Not calm, exactly. Something more like decided, which was different. "I chose it. I chose to come here. I chose the man I married. I chose the work and the cold and the distance from everything I'd ever known. And I made that choice with clear eyes and a clear head and no one's permission but my own." She stopped. "Let that sit for a second. You didn't lose me, Silas. I left. There's a difference and you know it." His face had done nothing visible during this, which was its own kind of response. He was watching her with the flat, assessing attention of a man who is listening to understand where the leverage is, not to understand the person speaking. "You don't know what you chose," he said. "You were scared, and you made a desperate decision, and you ended up—" His eyes moved past her again, a quick dismissive sweep. "Here, with a man you don't know." "I know him," she said, "better than I've ever known anyone. And I know me, which is something you spent 12 years trying to prevent." The flatness in her voice had acquired an edge now, not raised, just sharper. "You want to know what the most useful thing I've learned in this cabin is? It's not how to shoot or how to preserve food or how to read the weather. It's that I'm capable of things. That I was always capable of things. That the story you told about me, about who I was and what I could manage and what I needed you to do for me, that story was about your need to tell it, not about me at all." Something finally moved in Silas's face then. It wasn't remorse. She wasn't naive enough to expect remorse. And it wasn't rage, which was what she'd feared. It was something subtler and in some ways more revealing. A moment of genuine surprise, quickly suppressed, as if the person standing in this doorway did not entirely match the person he had ridden 2 days to collect. "You're going to make a speech at me," he said. "I'm almost done," she said. "One more thing." She put her hand on the doorframe, not gripping it for support, but resting it there, the way you rest your hand on something that belongs to you. "You're going to go back down the mountain. You're going to go back to Caldwell or wherever you've settled yourself. And you're going to build a life that isn't organized around managing mine. Because I'm not coming back. Not in a month. Not when it gets hard. Not ever. And if you ride up here again—" She stopped, started again. "Don't ride up here again." The yard was very quiet. The mare shifted in the barn. The wind had dropped to almost nothing, which gave the morning a specific kind of crystalline quality, sound carrying further than normal, edges sharper than they should have been. Silas looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Gideon, who had moved without noise to stand just behind Ilara's left shoulder, not in front of her, not between them, but present. Visible. An unmistakable statement about the geometry of this situation. Gideon said nothing. He didn't need to. He stood there with the same quality of presence that the mountain had. Not threatening, not posturing, simply immovable in the way that things are immovable when they have decided to be. Silas looked back at his sister. She watched him do the calculation. She'd seen him do it so many times that she could read the stages of it. The assessment of force, the measurement of will, the cold pragmatic weighing of whether the outcome he'd ridden up here to achieve was still achievable. She watched him work through it, and she held his gaze through all of it, and she did not look away. He looked away first. It was small, a glance at the ground, at his horse, at the ridge trail he'd come down. Almost nothing. But it was the first time in her memory that Silas Ashcombe had looked away first, and the meaning of it landed in her body before it reached her mind. A physical loosening, somewhere in her chest, something that had been wound tight for so many years she'd stopped noticing the tension. "You've changed," he said. He said it like an accusation. "Yes," she said, significantly. He turned to his horse. He moved with the same deliberate, controlled pace he'd arrived with, untying the reins from the fence post with practiced efficiency, stepping into the stirrup with the ease of a man who had spent most of his adult life on horseback. He settled into the saddle and sat there for a moment, looking down at her from the height the horse gave him. "If it goes wrong," he said. His voice had changed, quieter, something in it she didn't have an easy name for. "If it doesn't work out, you know where I am." She looked up at him. She didn't know what to do with that. It was the most human thing she'd heard him say in her entire life, and it arrived at the worst possible time, and she hated him a little for it in that moment. For the fact that he was capable of it, had always been capable of it, and had chosen everything else instead. "I know where you are," she said. Not a promise, not an invitation, just an acknowledgement. He turned the horse and rode back toward the north trail without looking back, and the sound of his horse on the frozen ground diminished by degrees until it was gone, absorbed by the distance and the cold and the indifferent silence of the mountain. Alara stood in the doorway and watched the tree line long after the sound was gone. She became aware gradually that her right hand was shaking, just the one hand. She looked down at it with something like curiosity. The steadiness she'd felt through the whole confrontation had been real, not performed, but apparently her body had been saving something up and was now presenting the bill. She closed the hand into a fist and held it that way. Gideon stepped up beside her, not touching her, just standing there. "You all right?" he asked. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. He nodded. That was the right answer, and he seemed to know it. She stood there in the cold doorway for another minute, watching the tree line, watching the empty trail. The snow in the yard showed Silas's boot prints clearly. The path he'd walked from horse to door, the place he'd stood, the path back. In a few hours, the wind would fill them in, or the temperature would crust them over, and they'd be unreadable. By tomorrow, they'd be invisible. She turned and walked back inside. Gideon came in behind her and closed the door, and the cold was shut out. And the stove was doing its steady, ordinary work, and the porridge she'd abandoned was overcooked and stuck to the bottom of the pot. She looked at the pot. Then she laughed. A short, slightly broken sound. More release than humor, but real. "I ruined the porridge," she said. "There's more oats," Gideon said. He moved to the shelf and took down the oat tin with the matter-of-fact efficiency that was so deeply characteristic of him, as if the morning's events had been noted and recorded and were now being properly filed so that practical life could resume. She sat down at the table and put both hands flat on its surface, the heavy square table he'd built himself. Not pretty, but solid, and breathed. Gideon started a new pot without being asked and without commenting on the state of the old one, and the cabin filled with the sound of ordinary morning, and it was such an aggressively normal sound after everything that she had to close her eyes for a moment just to absorb it. "He won't come back," she said. She wasn't asking. She was thinking out loud, working through her own understanding of her brother. "He'll tell himself he might. He'll keep the option open in his head because he can't bear to close it completely. But he won't come back. Coming back after that would mean admitting that what happened here was a defeat and not a strategic withdrawal." She opened her eyes. "He needs to believe he could have won if he'd chosen to. Coming back takes that away." Gideon was stirring the new pot. He glanced over at her. "You know him well." "I spent 24 years studying him," she said. "You get to know someone pretty well when your safety depends on it." He didn't respond to that. He didn't need to. He ladled out 2 bowls and set them on the table and sat down across from her, and they ate the replacement porridge in the specific silence that had become theirs over these months. Not the silence of people with nothing to say, but the silence of people who had established enough trust that the absence of words was itself a form of conversation. About halfway through the bowl, she noticed that her right hand had stopped shaking. She noticed it the same way she'd noticed back in January, the day she hadn't tracked the doors, quietly, privately, without making anything of it. just a fact registered and stored, the body catching up to what the mind had already decided. "Gideon," she said. He looked up. "Thank you," she said, "for standing there, for letting me—" She stopped. The word she wanted was complicated. "For letting it be mine," she said finally. He was quiet for a moment. Something in his face moved, the way it sometimes did when he was about to say something that cost him something, and she had learned not to rush those moments. "When I placed that advertisement," he said slowly, "I told myself it was practical. Companionship and divided labor and maybe some sanity in the winters." He looked at his bowl. "I told myself I wasn't looking for anything more than that because the last time I'd wanted more than that from a person, things ended badly, and I'd decided it wasn't worth the exposure." He paused. "I want you to know I understand I was wrong about that second part." She looked at him across the table. "Not asking anything from you," he added, with the careful precision of a man who has chosen every word. "Just wanted to be honest, since that seems to be what we do." "It is what we do," she agreed. She looked down at the table. At the ring on her finger, sized correctly now since their last supply run to Halverson's, it had stopped sliding around sometime in December, and she'd grown so accustomed to its presence that she sometimes forgot it was there until a moment like this, when she looked and found it still in place. Still real. "I'm not good at this," she said. She meant the larger thing, the trust, the openness, the terrifying arithmetic of letting someone matter. "I want to be. I think I'm getting better at it. But I'm not. I have a lot of damage, Gideon, and not all of it knows it's allowed to heal yet." "I know," he said. "That doesn't bother you." "No," he said simply. "I've got my own. We're even." Outside, the February morning was doing what February mornings did, cold and gray and utterly committed to its own nature, with no particular regard for the human events taking place at its feet. The mountain stood as it had always stood, enormous and patient and completely indifferent to the small drama that had just concluded in its shadow. But something had ended in that yard. She knew it the way you know things that happen in the body before the mind has processed them. In the looseness in her shoulders, in the steadiness of her hands, in the way the cabin looked when she glanced around it now. The same walls, the same shelves, the same curtain partition and battered table and rifle leaning against the door. All the same, and entirely different in every way that counted. She picked up her spoon and finished the porridge, and across the table Gideon did the same, and neither of them said anything else for a while because there was a specific kind of quiet that follows a long storm's end. Not comfortable exactly, and not easy, but clean. The kind of quiet that means something is over and something else is possible, and the space between those two things belongs entirely to the people standing in it. The days after Silas left had a quality she couldn't immediately name. Not relief. Relief was too simple a word for something this complicated. It was more like the feeling after a fever breaks. The body still remembers the heat, still carries the exhaustion of having fought something, but the fighting is done, and what's left is the strange, raw openness of a person who has come back to themselves from a long distance. She woke the morning after and lay still in the dark for the usual 3 seconds of disorientation, and then remembered where she was. And this time, the remembering carried something new in it. Not just the confirmation that she was safe, the confirmation that she had made herself safe. There was a difference between those two things that she was only beginning to understand the full weight of. She got up and lit the stove. February finished itself quietly after that. The remaining weeks passed without drama, which felt like a gift the mountain was offering somewhat reluctantly, as if it had decided to let the humans on its surface catch their breath before the next thing. The snow continued its patient occupation of the landscape. The trapping lines continued to produce. Alara continued to learn, to practice, to make mistakes and correct them without anyone making those mistakes mean more than they were. One afternoon near the end of the month, she was in the barn with the mare, working through the grooming that the horse submitted to with the resigned tolerance of an animal that had accepted this as the price of good treatment, and she caught herself humming. Just quietly, under her breath, something without a name or a melody she could identify. Just sound, just the involuntary expression of a person whose interior was not, in that moment, occupied entirely by vigilance. She stopped when she noticed. Then she thought about stopping, and deliberately started again. Small. Ridiculous, maybe. But she filed it the way she filed all the significant small things, and she held on to it. March came in like March always did at high elevation, which is to say, it came in lying. It presented a week of weather so unexpectedly mild that the snowpack began to show the first faint suggestions of surrender at its edges, and Alara made the mistake of letting herself believe it. Then the second week delivered a storm that was the worst of the entire winter. 3 days of driving snow and wind that kept them cabin-bound and reduced visibility in the yard to almost nothing. They were stuck inside for 2.5 days, and it was the first time they'd been truly confined to the same space without the option of outside work to give each of them room to breathe. And Alara discovered 2 things. First, that she was not good at enforced stillness, and second, that Gideon was somehow worse. He had a physical restlessness when the weather trapped him that he usually managed to conceal behind quiet tasks, but after 36 hours of confinement, it started to show through at the edges. He paced. Not large paces, the cabin was too small for that, but small redirections, moving from one side of the table to the other, checking the window for the 4th time in an hour, picking up the same piece of equipment he'd already examined twice and putting it down again. She watched this for a while and then she said, without particularly thinking about whether it was wise, "You're terrible at being still?" He stopped, looked at her with an expression of someone caught in something. "I know," he said. "I thought it was just me," she said. "No," he admitted. "I've always been... I don't do well when I can't move." He sat down at the table with the particular deliberateness of someone choosing to be still as an act of will rather than comfort. "My father used to say I was like a dog that needed to be run," which wasn't a kind comparison, but wasn't wrong. "Your father said a lot of useful, unkind things, apparently." He had the gift, Gideon agreed, and that almost smile appeared, and she realized she had stopped thinking of it as almost anything. It was just his smile. It was just the way his face did what it did. "Play me something," she said. He looked at her with genuine surprise, which was still a rare enough expression on him that she noticed it. "What?" "You have a harmonica," she said. "I've seen it on the shelf. You've never played it." A long pause. "I'm not good." "I don't care." He looked at the shelf, looked at her, looked back at the shelf. With the specific reluctance of a private person being asked to share something they'd kept private for good reason, he got up and retrieved the harmonica, a small, battered thing, the brass worn where it had been handled too much, and sat back down and held it for a moment as if reconsidering. Then he played. She told him she didn't care if he was good, and she'd meant it in the moment, but as it turned out, he was better than not good. Not skilled in a trained way, not someone who had practiced scales and learned theory, but musical in the way people are musical who have played alone for years, raw and genuine and entirely without performance. The melody he played was slow and without a clear beginning or ending, more like a mood than a song, and it filled the small cabin with a sound that did something immediate and unexpected to the quality of the air inside it. She didn't say anything when he stopped. She didn't want to make a thing of it. "Again?" she said. He played 3 more times before the storm broke the next morning. She would think about that later, about those hours inside the storm, the harmonica filling the space between them, the fire doing its work, the mountain pressing against the walls. She would think about it as one of the moments when the line between arrangement and something else blurred past the point of useful distinction. Not because it was romantic in any obvious sense, because it was real, because it was 2 imperfect people in a hard place doing the thing that people do when they stop managing each other and start simply being present. And presence, she was learning, was the rarest and most demanding thing one person could offer another. Spring announced itself in the 2nd week of April, and unlike March, it was honest about its intentions. The snowpack gave up its lower elevations first, the south-facing slopes going pale, and then brown, and then astonishingly green at the edges. The sound of meltwater appeared in the mornings, a new voice in the mountain's vocabulary, and the light changed in a way that was almost physical, longer and more direct, hitting surfaces that had been in shadow for months. The mare became a different animal in spring. She moved with an energy she hadn't shown since October, nostrils wide, taking in the changed air with the undisguised enthusiasm of a creature that had endured winter as a pragmatic necessity and was now done enduring it. Alara felt something similar and was not embarrassed about it. They started expanding the kitchen garden in the 3rd week of April. The ground was still difficult, grudging about it, the frost not entirely gone from the deeper layers, but workable, and Gideon had seed stock that had wintered well in the cellar. He knew what grew at this elevation and what didn't, and he planned the beds accordingly, and Alara worked beside him in the cold morning soil with the specific physical satisfaction of labor that had a direct and visible result. "You ever grow anything before?" he asked one morning, tamping soil around a row of onion sets. "Window herbs," she said. "At the laundry. Ruth let me keep them on the sill." She paused. "Silas threw them out once. He said they were taking up space that wasn't mine to use." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "What kind?" "Rosemary and thyme, and one basil that never did very well, but I kept trying." He looked at something over her shoulder, the south wall of the cabin where the morning sun hit longest. "There's a good spot on that wall," he said. "Sheltered. Gets the sun from about 8 in the morning through midday. We could build a shelf out from it. Herbs would do well there." She looked at the wall, looked back at him. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "I want to." He went back to the onion sets. "We'll build it next week when the current frosts are done." She turned back to her own row and kept working, and the thing in her chest that happened sometimes, that complicated, compressed feeling when someone did something kind without transaction, happened, and she let it. The shelf went up the following Tuesday. Cedar because Gideon said it handled the weather better than pine, and she had no reason to disagree with that. He built it with the same unhurried precision he brought to every physical task, measuring twice, checking the level 3 times, using hardware that was better than strictly necessary because, he said, a thing worth building was worth building to last. She planted rosemary, thyme, 2 kinds of sage, and a basil she had absolutely no confidence in at this elevation, but was trying anyway on principle. The basil died 6 weeks later. She planted another one. That one did slightly better. May brought the first neighbor contact since the autumn. A family called Brennan, husband, wife, 3 children, homesteading 4 miles east along the same ridge, sent their oldest boy up the trail with a note asking if they could borrow a specific tool Gideon had mentioned having, and Gideon sent it back with the boy along with a bag of dried beans from the winter stores because the Brennans had arrived late in the season, and he knew their cellar would be running thin. "You've done that before," Alara said when the boy had gone. "Done what?" "Sent extra, given more than what was asked." He shrugged. "They've got children, and Brennan's a decent man. He worked a double share all fall to get that cabin ready." "Did he ask for the beans?" "No." She filed that. She was still filing things about him, still finding new angles in what she thought she'd already mapped. He was better at generosity than he was at receiving it. That was something she'd identified early and continued to observe. He gave without ceremony and accepted thanks with the specific discomfort of a man who had spent too long alone to be entirely easy about mattering to people. She understood that feeling in her bones. In June, the Brennan family came to call. All 5 of them, on a Sunday, with a covered dish and a jug of something homemade, and the slightly formal energy of people who were taking neighborliness seriously, because out here, at this elevation and this distance from town, neighborliness was not a social nicety. It was infrastructure. Clara Brennan was a small, direct woman in her 30s with flour on her sleeve that she either hadn't noticed or didn't consider worth addressing, and she shook Alara's hand at the door with the grip of someone who had been doing physical work for a long time and didn't modulate it for company. "We've been meaning to come sooner," she said, stepping inside with the ease of someone accustomed to entering unfamiliar cabins. But March was a disaster, and April wasn't much better, and then Tom put his back out in May. "He's better now?" Alara asked. "Functional," Clara said, with the particular tone of a woman describing a husband's recovery with more precision than sentiment. "He'll overdo it again by August and we'll have the whole thing over." Tom Brennan was a big, easy-moving man with a handshake that matched his wife's and 3 children who immediately began an investigation of the cabin's perimeter with the systematic curiosity of small people encountering a new environment. The youngest, a girl of about 4, located the mare through the barn window and stood there pressing her face to the glass with the absolute absorption of a child who has temporarily forgotten that other dimensions of reality exist. Alara watched her and felt something she didn't immediately have a category for. Not longing exactly, something quieter. a kind of noticing. They ate outside because the day allowed it. The first genuinely warm day, warm enough for shirt sleeves in the midday sun, the mountains above them still showing white at the highest peaks, but the yard itself soft and green and smelling of things growing. Gideon and Tom talked about timber work and the ridge trail conditions, and whether the Eastern Creek was good for fishing yet, and Clara and Alara talked about preserving and the garden and the specific challenges of keeping a root cellar in this soil. And at some point, the conversation found the easy rhythm that happens between people who share a context, who understand the same terrain, the same weather, the same particular calculations that go into living at this elevation through a year's full turn. "How are you finding it?" Clara asked at one point, refilling her own cup from the jug without asking, which Alara appreciated. "The mountain. It's a different life." "Yes," Alara said. "It is." She thought about how to answer honestly. "I'm finding that I'm better at it than I expected to be." Clara looked at her with the direct, evaluating gaze of a woman who has very little time for anything that isn't true. Then she nodded once. "I could see that," she said. "Some people come up here and spend the whole first year looking back at the valley. You're not doing that." "No," Alara said. "I'm not." Later that evening, after the Brennans had packed themselves up and started back down the trail, the children tired enough that Tom was carrying the youngest on his back, and the other two were moving with the slightly glazed efficiency of the nearly asleep. Alara and Gideon stood in the yard in the long June light and watched them go. "Good people," Gideon said. "Yes," she agreed. Then, "She said I wasn't looking back at the valley." He glanced at her. "Clara Brennan," she clarified. "She said some people spend the whole first year looking back at where they came from. She said I wasn't." "Are you?" he asked. She considered it. The valley was down there somewhere, 40 miles south, Caldwell Crossing with its notice board and its postal counter, and Martha Beale's watching eyes. Her brother somewhere in it, building whatever life he was building with the space she'd left. The laundry where she'd slept behind the boiler. All of it real, all of it actual, and all of it behind her. "No," she said. "I'm not." They went back inside and made supper, and the evening passed the way evenings had come to pass, quietly, with the particular texture of shared silence that they'd built together over months of practice. But something was different in it. Something she'd been circling for a while had come close enough to look at directly. She waited until supper was done and the dishes handled and they were both at the table, Gideon with his ledger and she with the mending that was never entirely finished, and she said, "I want to tell you something." He looked up. "I spent 12 years being told what I was," she said. "Not in words, always. A lot of it wasn't words. Just the way things were arranged. The pantry locked, the work assigned, the people I wasn't allowed to know." She looked at the thimble on her finger. Her mother's thimble, which she wore when she sewed. "I came here because I needed to be somewhere else. That was the whole of it. I wasn't thinking about anything past the distance." She paused. He was watching her with the same careful attention he'd always given her, but without the careful distance he sometimes maintained. Something in him was still. "I'm thinking about things past the distance now," she said. "I want you to know that." He set down the pencil. He didn't say anything for a moment, and she let him have the moment because she had learned that his silences were not avoidance, they were processing, and the difference mattered. "I told you in February," he said, "that I'd been wrong about not wanting more than the arrangement." He paused. "I want to say it more plainly. I'm not good at this kind of conversation. I don't have a lot of practice." "Neither do I," she said. "Then we're even. Again." He looked at her. "I don't know exactly how this goes. I think what we are is already more than I said I was looking for when I placed that advertisement." A slight pause. "Probably more than either of us said we were looking for." "Probably," she agreed. "I don't want to make it into something with requirements," he said carefully. "I don't want to name it in a way that puts weight on it before it's ready to hold weight." She thought about that. "That might be the wisest thing you've ever said." "I have my moments," he said, and the smile appeared. The real one, the full one that she had only seen a handful of times and that changed his whole face when it arrived. And she felt the specific thing that she felt in those moments, which was still terrifying and was getting less so by degrees. "We could just keep going," she said. the way we've been going, and let it be what it is. Yes, he said. That. She went back to the mending. He went back to the ledger. The fire did its ordinary work. Outside, the June evening was doing something generous with the last of the light, and the mountain above them held its ancient position against the darkening sky. And the cabin was warm and imperfect and entirely real. She thought about what Clara Brennan had said, not looking back at the valley. She understood now that it wasn't just true. It was the measure of something, the measure of how far she'd actually come, not in miles, but in the thing that miles can't capture. The distance between who you were when fear was the organizing principle of your life and who you were when it wasn't. She wasn't there entirely. She knew that. She still woke some mornings with the old reflexes firing, the calculating, the scanning, the quick inventory of threat and proximity. Some things take longer to unlearn than others, and she had a lot to unlearn. But the reflexes were slower now. The space between the old response and the new one was growing, day by day, like the gap between winter and spring, imperceptible in any single day, undeniable across weeks. She thought about this woman who had stood at the post office notice board with a single coin in her pocket, reading 4 lines about a man on a mountain. She felt a complicated tenderness for that woman. Not pity. She'd had enough pity in her life to last 3 lifetimes, and none of it had ever helped. But tenderness. The way you feel tenderness for a version of yourself that survived something without knowing it would survive. That woman had been desperate and had made a decision in desperation, and the decision had turned out to contain things she'd never imagined being offered. That wasn't a lesson about desperation being a good guide. It was a lesson about the way choices made for one reason can grow into something you never intended if you're willing to do the work that's waiting inside them. The work had been considerable. It continued to be considerable. There was nothing easy about rebuilding yourself in a new place with a new person when most of what you knew about yourself had been handed to you by someone who needed you to be small. You had to keep checking the old measurements against the new evidence. You had to keep asking, every day, in the small practical moments of ordinary life, is this true or is this the story? And sometimes you couldn't tell, and you had to sit with not knowing until the fog cleared. But the fog was clearing. She could feel it in the way she moved through the cabin now, through the yard, through the daily work, no longer mapping exits, no longer calculating other people's moods as a matter of survival. She was just living, imperfectly, uncertainly, with a damage that still made itself known in unexpected moments, but living forward. The mountain had done that. Not by being kind. The mountain was not kind, had never been kind, would bury you without hesitation or remorse if you made the wrong call on the wrong day. But it had been honest, and in its honesty it had demanded the same from her. You could not survive here on pretense. You could not manage this terrain with a false account of your own capabilities. The mountain required you to know what you actually were, what you could actually do, and to work from that truth instead of from the comfortable lie. She had found, once she started working from the truth, that the truth was considerably better than the lie she'd been given. July arrived and the garden was producing, and the mare had foaled, a long-legged, improbable creature that stood on its first day with the concentrated determination of something that had decided to exist and wasn't interested in taking longer about it than necessary. Alara was there for the birth, which was difficult and then suddenly wasn't, and she sat in the straw afterward with the foal's head in her lap while the mother rested. And Gideon crouched in the barn doorway, watching the 3 of them with an expression that he wasn't bothering to manage. "She's going to need a name," Alara said. "Your call," he said. She looked at the foal, the ridiculous length of her legs, the dark liquid eyes, already curious, already investigating the strange warm creature she'd landed on. "Time," she said. He looked at the herb shelf on the south wall, visible through the barn door, the rosemary going well, and the thyme thriving, and the second basil making a stubborn go of it. "Time," he agreed. That autumn, the Brennan family brought 2 other families from further along the ridge to a gathering at the Brennan place, and Gideon and Alara went, and there were 8 adults and 6 children in a cabin built for half that number. And it was loud and imperfect, and one of Tom Brennan's homebrew attempts turned out to be inadvisable, and someone's child knocked over an entire platter of cornbread. And it was the best evening Alara had spent in longer than she could calculate. On the ride back, The night was clear enough that the stars were an argument for the existence of scale. The kind of night sky you could only see this far from town, from electric light, from all the competing illuminations of people in proximity. The horses moved steadily on the familiar trail, and the mountain was all around them, dark and enormous, and very still. I used to think, Alara said, into the quiet, that if I could just get far enough away from Caldwell, from Silas, from all of it, that would be the thing, the destination. She could see her breath in the cold air, getting away. And now? Gideon asked. He was riding slightly ahead, but he turned his head so she could see his profile. Now I think getting away is just the start, she said. The actual thing is what you build after. The getting away just clears the ground. She paused. That sounds obvious, maybe, but I had to live it to understand it. He was quiet for a moment. The trail curved and he fell back alongside her, the horses close enough that she could have reached over and touched his arm. It's not obvious, he said. Most people never figure it out. They spend their whole life focused on the leaving and never put any weight on the arriving. He paused. I did it too. Came up here, got the distance I needed from everything below, spent years maintaining the distance like that was the goal. He looked at the trail ahead. Took a 4-line advertisement and a woman with 1 coin and a good deal more nerve than I had to point out that the distance was just the beginning. She looked at him. I didn't point it out. You demonstrated it, he said, which is better. They rode the rest of the way in the particular silence that had become, over the months and now over a year, one of the languages they spoke to each other. Not empty, not avoidant, but full of the kind of weight that words would only have diminished. The cabin appeared through the trees with its window-lit amber from the banked stove inside, and the herb shelf on the south wall showed dark against the logs. And somewhere in the barn, Time made a small sound that was the hoarse version of hello. And Alara looked at all of it and felt the word that had arrived somewhere in the deep of winter and never left. Home. Not the home of her childhood, which had been a place where she learned to make herself small. Not the home of obligation or accident or the absence of anywhere better. A home she had chosen, built in, added herself to piece by piece until the shape of the place included her the same way the mountains included the trees. Not by tolerance, but by belonging. The deep structural kind that doesn't ask permission. She dismounted in the yard and stood for a moment in the dark while Gideon took the horses to the barn, and she looked up at the mountain above them, at the enormous, indifferent face of it, the peaks that had been here before any of their stories and would be here after all of them. And she thought about what it had given her. Not warmth, not safety, exactly, not comfort, which it had never once offered. It had given her the hard, necessary, irreplaceable gift of being required to be real. That was everything. That was the whole of it. She went inside and put the kettle on and waited for him to come in from the barn. And when he did, he stomped the mud off his boots the way he always did and hung his coat on the same peg he always used and sat at the table with the familiar settled weight of a man in the place where he belonged. And she put 2 cups on the table and sat across from him, and the stove ticked warmly, and somewhere outside the mountain went on being the mountain. And the story that had started with a single coin and 4 lines on a notice board was not finished. It was nowhere near finished. It had years of itself left. Good years and hard years and years that would ask things of both of them they didn't know yet they were capable of giving. But it was theirs. Every imperfect, unresolved, continuing inch of it.